Teens. Sounds familiar? Don't worry, I'm not reliving the dreadful memories from 1.5 or 2 years back. Rather, I'm going to take you back nearly 125 years in time to the city of Bombay, a thriving metropolis that was brought to its knees by a devastating outbreak of plague. Clear? Alright. The context could have been vastly different under a colonial regime, but the response and the consequences share some very peculiar similarities with COVID. The plague in late 19th century redefined the landscape of Bombay, shaping it the way we know it today, and as I shall elucidate subsequently, had a decisive impact on the contours of national politics. A very good morning to one and all present over here. I'm Anirudh, a student of Hansraj College, and consider it a huge honor to receive this opportunity of presenting my paper today. Diseases are frequently considered peripheral to our historical imagination, as wars and social movements often take precedence. Through this paper, I wish to emphasize how diseases can indeed have very massive ramifications on urban governance and anti-colonial discourse, and how they transform social relations and political structures such that they retain an influence several years even after the disease dissipates. So I'll just move on to the next slide and orient you with how I shall proceed with this presentation. So I'll be starting off with looking at how Bombay transformed into Urbs Prima in Indis, which basically in Latin stands for the first Indian city. So how did this transformation of Bombay into a thriving industrial entrepot take place? I'll start with the background. Moving on, I'll discuss how the outbreak of plague in 1896-97 led to a lot of heated antagonism between the elites, the ruling elites, and the governed classes. And what are the inferences, the larger inferences that can be drawn from there? I'll then subsequently look at the city reconstruction that took place, especially in the first decade after the plague epidemic, and the activities of the Bombay City Improvement Trust and how its uneven ramifications changed the landscape of Bombay. After that, I will analyze official discourse and what is it that we can infer from the comments that are being made on sanitary hygiene and the urban poor. What are the larger inferences that can be drawn, and I'll be extending that to argue that the epidemic indeed had a very major impact on the anti-colonial movement and anti-colonial discourse, on the way we understand the freedom struggle as well. So we can move to the next slide, please. So starting off with discussing about Bombay as such in the late 19th century, we must remember that it was only in the 19th century that Bombay supplanted Surat as the commercial hub and Pune as the political center of Western India. As renowned urban historian Meera Koshambi points out, Bombay's rise in prominence could be chiefly attributed to the primacy of colonial port cities rather than any locational factors. So Bombay's rise as an industrial city in the second half of the 19th century was largely determined by propitious global developments. In a sense, you had American Civil War between 1861 and 65 that led to the sprouting up of textile industries across Bombay, and you also had the opening of the Suez Canal in 1859. That also in many ways stimulated the rise of industrial capitalism in Bombay. And after that, what we notice is that the emergence of cotton textile industries was followed by an influx of migrant laborers into Bombay. And the scale of this influx will be seen later on when the plague breaks out in 1896-97. So, moreover, after suppressing the revolt of 1857, the British consciously manipulated Bombay's urban landscape to illustrate their imperial authority. So we notice, as you can see to your left, that's the fort area. The lavish bungalows of the fort area contrasted with the congested shawls in the native town. To your right, you have Sheikh Memon Street or Zaveri Bazaar near Crawford Market today. So this contrast is what historian Mariam Dosal calls a spatial coexistence of two distinct economies at work. So we have two economies that are interdependent, but they are still differentiated in terms of face. And this was what was produced by the late 19th century. It was a very, very methodological pursuit of separation between the native town and the town that's inhabited by the British elites. Next slide, please. So we also notice that this plague, the outbreak of plague, it completely unraveled all of these meticulous arrangements made by the British. The first case of plague was officially reported from Mandvi, which is in South Bombay slum, in August 1896. And it took about 2 months for the British to actually realize the scale of the magnitude of the epidemic that had struck. So on 6th October 1896, the municipal commissioner was given legal sanction to enter and disinfect buildings, remove goods from houses, and to basically isolate houses in which a case of plague had occurred. So the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 further consolidated these unrestrained powers given to the state. So the state would literally, officials would enter houses, they would forcibly hospitalize people, and sick family members were segregated. And moreover, plague, the houses that were infected with plague were labeled, and this is from official discourse. R. Nathan, W.A. Couchman, all of them, they have written about this. They would literally be labeled unfit for human habitation. Any shawl, any house that was infected with plague was labeled like that. And what we see as a brazen interventionism, David Arnold characterizes this as an unprecedented right over the health and bodies of subjects displayed by the colonial powers. So David Arnold is a prominent subaltern historian, and what he says is that this is an assault on the bodies of the subjects. But this argument is disputed by Prashant Kidambi. Prashant Kidambi has produced a very recent work on the history of Bombay as an urban city and its transition. And what Kidambi suggests is that we need to look at the class basis on which these interventions are taking place. So the urban poor are being disproportionately affected by the policies, by the interventions that made by the colonial states. And it is essentially this class basis that we need to take cognizance of. So it's not an unmitigated assault on the bodies of the subjects. It is still differentiated. That's what Kidambi points out. But Arnold's thesis is based on this fact that, you know, when they literally enter the house, you look at where the symptoms of plague can be seen. It is in the armpits or the groins. So literally and figuratively, it was an assault on the bodies of the subjects. That is what he wanted to say when he made that argument. Now, how do people resist to that? That resistance also is very interesting because they use very innovative techniques to resist. Some people, they literally, they conceal themselves within their houses. Some dead, they conceal their own dead within the houses, or they showed as if they were preoccupied, they didn't cooperate with the British. Or the most common tactic, in fact, employed by slum dwellers at this point of time was flight. And this has been studied by several historians like Aditya Sarkar and Sandeep Hazari Singh, wherein by January 1897, we see that nearly 4 lakh people had fled from Bombay. And just listen to this figure. It's almost half the population of Bombay that has moved out in the span of 4 months. So this is the extent of migration that had taken place in the latter half of the 19th century. And this is going to reconfigure the urban landscape of Bombay. It's going to lead to some dynamic changes in urban governance as well. Next slide, please. I would like to ask a larger question and pose a larger question over here, which is that can we consider this particular conjuncture of the revolt and the subsequent, the kind of antagonisms that are being seen over here, can we consider this to be an 1857 moment for Bombay? Because there are some striking similarities in between both of them. Remember, 1857 largely happened in the north and central parts of India. And we notice that there's a complete breakdown of trust between colonized elites, the ruling elites, and the colonized masses. We see a complete breakdown of trust. We see that if it were the sepoys in the 1857, it is the working classes over here who are revolting. They are the ones who are essentially, there's a massive revolt in 1898, which completely paralyzes the city. So there are parallels over there, and then we see that grievances are also articulated in a religious idiom. Petitions addressed to them, petitions addressed to the commissioner, they also have a religious idiom to them. There are religious sentiments and communal sensibilities that are activated. And finally, we notice that it also, as Rajnarayan Chandavarkar points out, it crystallized anxieties regarding government's hold on the empire. So, taking all of this into consideration, I would like to argue that this was indeed an 1857 moment for Bombay. In what other way is it an 1857 moment? Because after 1857, there were some major changes in governance in India. Next slide, please. I'd like to move on. We notice that the City Improvement Trust that was constituted in around 1898, in December 1898, this had a major impact on the way Bombay exists today. The way we understand Bombay today, the differentiated spaces that we see today, the floods that we experience today, the Bombay City Improvement Trust had a major role to play over there, right? So the Improvement Trust was ostensibly constituted to provide room for the expansion of city, constructing, and more importantly, to construct sanitary dwellings for the poor. But the trust miserably failed to honor its promise of rehousing the poor. It had to basically, the idea was that it had to provide sanitary accommodation for the poor, but it was unable to do that because what happened was that since they are reclaiming land from the oceans, remember that Bombay was originally 7 different islands, so they're literally reclaiming land from the oceans. What's happening is that the properties available are very less, and naturally the prices rise, there is a speculative boom, and the urban poor cannot afford the trust houses. So what they do is they shift from the shawls that they have been displaced from, they shift to other shawls, and the congestion problems only amplifies. So we notice that they are only amplifying the existing problems that are there in the city. So this whole idea of the improvement trust, setting up an improvement trust on English or Scottish values, it completely fails. And what we also see over here, as you can see, the kind of language that is being used, the patronizing kind of language that is used for the poor, we will let sun into their houses and all of that. All of this amounts to nothing at the end of, say, 1909 or 1910. But we have J.P. Orr, next slide please. We have J.P. Orr, who is the chairman of the Bombay City Improvement Trust. And he gives a series of lectures. Alright, there are several sanitary conferences that are taking place at this point of time. J.P. Orr delivers a number of lectures at this point in time from where we can deduce the kind of mentalities, the kind of motives that underpin a lot of these initiatives. We can deduce all of that. What we see to your right, J.P. Orr's statement, we notice that he is clearly saying he exhorts social reformers to educate public opinion by informing builders about the moral and financial benefits of investing in housing and demanding reasonably high standards of comfort and sanitation from the working classes. So what we notice is that at one level, these social reformers, who are like the Indian socio-political elites, they are being exhorted to influence the builders, to influence the capitalists, and also to influence the working classes, right? So here we notice that there is this pursuit of capital, there is this pursuit of profits that is driving them. And throughout the period, in fact, I haven't quoted this in the paper, but through my research I came to know, throughout the period they make innumerable statements to substantiate this, that their whole idea was to make profits for themselves and not to in any way empower the poor as they would like us to believe, right? So they wanted to make profits. That is one deduction that we can make. The second thing is the political thought that is embedded over here. When they are transferring, we must always remember that any social crisis, it leads to a reconfiguration of the notion of power, right? Any social crisis leads to this reconfiguration. So we notice that power is now being slightly given, it's given to the natives. I'll take you back to 1898 in R. Nathan, Plague in India. He's a civil servant who wrote just before the constitution of the Bombay Improvement Trust. And he wrote that it's important to acquire the concurrence and sympathy of the leaders of different sections of the native community. But over here, what we notice, if we read the statement carefully and analyze it, it is almost like an afterthought. It's almost like that we have the mantle of implementing all these measures, and giving some kind of concession to the native is like an afterthought. Whereas, with 2 decades later, there is a degree of centrality that is given to these social reformers or these socio-political elites. So what has happened in this span of 2 decades? This is where we enter the sphere of politics. This is where we enter what is happening in the elite level, right? Next slide, please. So,
excuse me, the time is up to conclude.
Yeah, I'm just concluding. Yeah. So, we noticed that the anti-colonial movement was also stimulated by the plague epidemic. So, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was a prominent, member of the Congress. We must remember that the Congress in the late 19th century was dominated by elites from Bombay. It was only in the early 20th century that it shifted to Bengal. The seat of political activities shifted to Bengal. Right? So this transformation is taking place, and what happens is that in the late 19th century, we notice a lot of these elites like Gokhale, we have Firoz Shah Mehta, all of them, they actively participate and collaborate with the government. They help the government in all these policies, in all these activities of sanitation, or even going inside slums and all of that. But by this time, through the activities of the Improvement Trust, they get alienated. Why? Because there is large-scale acquisition of property. So this property elite, the alienation of the property elite, and the shift of political site from Bombay to Bengal is also an important consequence of the plague epidemic and its aftermath. We also noticed that the revolutionary movement, and here I'd like to say this was my entry point to this subject, this topic, because I only knew about, because I stay in Pune, I'm from Pune, so I knew about the killing of W.C. Rand by the Chapekar brothers. This was a very, very important moment in the revolutionary movement for India. It triggered a resurgence of revolutionary activity, and this was also, in many ways, it also elevated Lokmanya Tilak from being a prominent leader in Maharashtra to being a leader who's known in other parts of the country as well, right? So, I'd like to conclude by basically revisiting what are the major conclusions that I make in this paper. The perils of industrial capitalism and administrative ineptitude were chiefly responsible for transforming the slums of Bombay into favorable plague ecologies. The Bombay Improvement Trust, established to herald a new dawn in the sanitary sphere, ended up reneging on its promises and amplifying problems for the urban poor. And what we also noticed that in its far-reaching socio-political consequences, the epidemic does seem to share a lot of striking parallels with the 1857 revolts, and such an inference should help situate this plague epidemic within the larger history of the evolution of Indian nationalism and anti-colonial struggle. Also, it should inform us about the dangers of devolving unrestrained powers to any state during a situation of emergency, and the kind of disturbances and dynamisms that can be stoked up because of that. Thank you so much for patient listening. I look forward to questions from you.